key autumn wind of 1847 Vienna carried the scent of fallen leaves and anticipation through the cobblestone streets. But inside the opulent Palazzo Schwarzburg, the air was thick with the fragrance of white roses and the weight of aristocratic judgment. Golden chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, while crystal glasses clinked in rhythmic conversation among Austria's most distinguished nobility. Clara Beaumont adjusted her white silk gloves for the third time, her emerald eyes surveying the magnificent ballroom with a mixture of awe and apprehension. At 19, she possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed almost out of place among the powdered faces and elaborate gowns of the Viennese elite. Her teal silk dress, though elegant, was noticeably simpler than the jewel-encrusted gowns that swirled around her like peacock feathers in a garden of gold. "Remember, my dear," whispered her aunt, Countess Marguerite de Beaumont, leaning close with practiced discretion, "you are here by invitation of the Archduke himself. Your musical education in Lyon was exceptional, but these people, double quotes." She paused, her kind blue eyes scanning the room with the wisdom of someone who had navigated these treacherous social waters for decades. "They measure worth by bloodlines, not talent." Clara nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. She had arrived in Vienna only 3 weeks ago, following her aunt who served as a governess to the imperial family. The transition from the comfortable bourgeois life of Lyon to the suffocating protocols of Austrian nobility had been jarring, like trying to learn a new language where every gesture carried the weight of centuries. Across the room, she noticed several young ladies her age whispering behind ornate fans, their gazes sharp as winter frost. Their conversations paused whenever she passed, replaced by the kind of silence that spoke volumes about exclusion and judgment. "The French girl thinks she belongs here," she caught one of them saying, the words delivered with surgical precision. "How quaint." The grand piano at the center of the ballroom commanded attention like a sleeping giant. A magnificent Beisendorfer, its ebony surface reflecting the golden light of 100 candles. Clara felt drawn to it, her fingers unconsciously moving in gentle patterns against her dress, following melodies that existed only in her mind. The mysterious Mademoiselle Beaumont, a deep voice cut through her reverie like velvet wrapped around steel. Clara turned to find herself face to face with Marquis Victor von Habsburg, whose reputation for intellectual cruelty preceded him like a dark shadow. At 32, Victor possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that spoke of generations of careful breeding. His steel blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to wielding power through words rather than swords. A subtle scar above his left eyebrow only added to his intimidating presence, a reminder of a dueling incident that had become legendary among Vienna's social circles. "Your Grace," Clara curtsied with practiced elegance, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I've been hearing the most fascinating rumors about you," Victor continued, circling her slowly like a predator studying prey. His black tailcoat with golden military decorations caught the light with each calculated movement. "They say you fancy yourself quite the musician. How refreshing to meet someone with such aspirations." The way he emphasized the word aspirations made it sound like a character flaw. Around them, conversations began to quiet as other guests sensed the approaching entertainment of social sport. "I've had the privilege of studying music, yes," Clara replied carefully, maintaining her composure despite the growing audience of silk-clad spectators. "Studying," Victor repeated with theatrical delight. "How wonderfully democratic of you. Tell me, what pieces have you mastered? Perhaps some simple folk melodies from your charming provincial background?" A ripple of barely concealed laughter swept through the gathering crowd. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a growing flame of indignation that she fought to contain. "Studied the classical masters, Your Grace. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, double quotes," she began, but Victor raised an elegantly gloved hand to silence her. "Ah, yes, the classics. But surely you understand there's a difference between playing notes and truly understanding music. Music, you see, is born from breeding, from generations of refinement, from an intrinsic understanding of beauty that simply cannot be acquired." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "It's rather like appreciating fine wine. One must be born with the palate for it." The crowd had grown larger now, forming a subtle circle around them. Clara caught sight of her aunt's worried expression across the room, but also noticed another figure, Archduke Franz von Sturek, his noble brown eyes watching the proceedings with what appeared to be growing disapproval. "Perhaps," Victor continued, warming to his performance, "our young friend would honor us with a demonstration? After all, nothing reveals the truth quite like public performance." Victor, came a warning voice from the crowd. Archduke Franz stepped forward, his white military uniform marking him as someone whose words carried imperial weight. Perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for such exhibitions, but Victor's predatory smile only widened. On the contrary, Your Highness. What better place to appreciate true artistry than among those who can recognize it? He turned back to Clara, his eyes glittering with malicious intent. Unless, of course, our young friend prefers to keep her talents private? The challenge hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, measuring, judging, waiting. In that moment she understood this was more than entertainment. It was a ritual of social exclusion, public confirmation that she would never belong in their world. But as her gaze fell upon the magnificent piano, something shifted within her. The instrument seemed to call to her, not as a judge, but as an old friend. Her fingers tingled with the memory of countless hours spent at her modest upright piano in Lyon, where music had been her refuge, her voice, her truest self. "I would be honored to play," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the now silent ballroom with surprising strength. Victor's triumphant expression faltered for just a moment, as if he hadn't expected her to accept. "Excellent," he recovered quickly. "Perhaps something simple? A minuet, perhaps? Or one of those charming little pieces suitable for young ladies?" Clara walked toward the piano with measured steps, feeling the weight of history in every footfall. The Bissendorfer was even more magnificent up close, its keys gleaming like pearls in moonlight. She removed her gloves carefully, placing them on the music stand with deliberate ceremony. As she adjusted the bench and flexed her fingers, the room fell into the kind of profound silence that occurs only in theaters before the curtain rises. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself in the way her first piano teacher had taught her as a child. Music, he had told her, is not about impressing others. It's about truth, your truth, spoken in a language older than words. When she opened her eyes, the faces around her seemed to fade into a soft blur. There's only the piano now. Only the music waiting to be born from the marriage of her soul and these ebony and ivory keys. Her hands found their position, and without announcement or fanfare she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like the first drops of rain before a storm. But there was something in those notes, a quality that made the gathered nobility unconsciously lean forward. It wasn't a piece they recognized, no familiar melody from their music boxes or drawing room entertainments. This was something entirely new, entirely hers. As the melody developed, it seemed to tell a story. The story of a young woman far from home, surrounded by beauty but starved of acceptance. The music spoke of longing, of dreams deferred, of the peculiar ache that comes from standing at the edge of belonging, but never quite stepping inside. Clara's fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm she was creating. The simple melody began to bloom into something more complex, harmonies weaving together like threads in an invisible tapestry. Her training in Lyon had given her technique, but this music came from somewhere deeper, from the place where sorrow meets hope and transforms into something transcendent. In the audience, Archduke Franz found himself holding his breath. He had heard the finest pianists in Europe, had attended concerts by virtuosos whose names were whispered with reverence in the salons of Paris and the concert halls of Berlin. But this this was different. This young French girl wasn't simply playing music. She was creating it, channeling something raw and honest and utterly compelling. Even Marquis Victor, who had expected to witness a humiliation, found his cruel smile slowly fading. The music seemed to reach inside him, touching places he had carefully walled off with years of aristocratic cynicism. Against his will, he felt something stir in his chest, not attraction, but recognition. As if the music was speaking directly to the parts of himself he kept hidden behind titles and traditions. The melody grew more complex, more urgent. Clara's hands danced across the keys with increasing passion, her earlier nervousness transformed into something approaching rapture. She was no longer in the ballroom at all, but somewhere else entirely, in a place where music was the only language that mattered, where truth could be spoken without fear of judgment. The piece began to build toward what felt like an inevitable climax, each phrase adding another layer to the emotional architecture she was constructing. Some in the audience found tears forming in their eyes without understanding why. The music seemed to capture something universal, the loneliness that exists even in crowded rooms, the courage required to be oneself in a world that demands conformity, the beauty that emerges when someone chooses authenticity over acceptance. As Clara's performance reached its crescendo, her entire being seemed to merge with the instrument. Her face, illuminated by candlelight, was transformed by an inner radiance that had nothing to do with physical beauty and everything to do with the pure expression of artistic truth. Her fingers flew across the keys with the certainty of birds returning home, creating cascades of sound that seemed to lift the very ceiling of the ballroom. And then, as suddenly as a candle being extinguished, the music stopped. Clara's hands remained poised above the keys for a moment as if she was reluctant to break the connection. Her breathing was slightly elevated, her cheeks flushed with the exertion of having poured her entire soul into the performance. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to face the audience. The silence was absolute. It's not the polite quiet that follows expected entertainment, but the profound hush that occurs when people have witnessed something that has fundamentally changed them. For long moments, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Tears glistened on more than one pair of aristocratic cheeks. Several of the young ladies who had whispered cruel comments earlier now looked stricken, as if seeing Clara clearly for the first time. Even the servants who had been moving discreetly through the crowd had stopped, their silver trays temporarily forgotten. Archduke Franz was the first to break the spell, beginning to applaud with slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the ballroom like gunshots. Within moments, the entire assembly had joined him, their applause building from respectful appreciation to something approaching ovation. But Clara's eyes were fixed on one person alone, Marquis Victor von Habsburg, whose cold mask of superiority had completely cracked. He stood frozen, his hands at his sides, staring at her with an expression of such naked vulnerability that it was almost painful to witness. In that moment, all his carefully constructed arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a man confronted with the undeniable truth of genuine artistry. "Extraordinary," breathed the Archduke, stepping forward. "Absolutely extraordinary. Mademoiselle Beaumont, was that your own composition?" Clara nodded, still somewhat dazed from the intensity of her performance. "Yes, Your Highness. It came to me just now." A murmur of amazement swept through the crowd. Improvisation was considered the highest form of musical art, the domain of only the most gifted composers. That this young Frenchwoman had created such a profound piece spontaneously was almost beyond comprehension. "Victor," the Archduke called, his voice carrying the authority of imperial blood, "I believe you had something to say about breeding and musical appreciation?" All eyes turned to the Marquis, who seemed to struggle with words for the first time in memory. His face had gone pale, making the scar above his eyebrow more pronounced. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was mistaken," he said, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. "Profoundly mistaken." He approached Clara slowly, as if moving through water. When he reached her, he performed a bow deeper than protocol required, the bow one gives to an equal, not a social inferior. "Mademoiselle," he said, his steel-blue eyes now swimming with unshed tears, "I offer you my most sincere apologies. Your music has reminded me of something I had forgotten." He paused, struggling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. "That true nobility has nothing to do with blood or titles. It has to do with the ability to touch the human soul." The transformation in the room was palpable. Where moments before Clara had been an outsider tolerated by courtesy, she was now the center of genuine admiration and respect. Young ladies who had snubbed her earlier now approached with shy smiles and requests for introduction. Gentlemen bowed with authentic deference rather than condescending politeness. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara herself, as she graciously accepted compliments and invitations. She carried herself with a new confidence, not the arrogance of victory, but the quiet certainty that comes from having found one's voice and used it without compromise. "My dear," her aunt whispered, appearing at her side with tears of pride in her eyes, "your parents would be so proud. You've done more than prove your worth tonight. You've proven that worth itself is defined by what we give to the world, not what the world gives to us." As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Archduke Franz lingered near the piano where Clara still sat, her fingers occasionally picking out soft melodies. "Mademoiselle Beaumont," he said, his manner warm but respectful, "I hope this won't be the last time we hear your music. Vienna needs voices like yours, honest voices that remind us of what art truly means." Clara smiled, feeling for the first time since arriving in Vienna that she might actually belong here after all. Not because she had conformed to their expectations, but because she had exceeded them by being utterly, authentically herself. "I would be honored to play again, Your Highness," she replied. "After all, music is a conversation. Tonight I finally found the courage to speak. Now I look forward to listening to what others have to say in return." As the great doors of Palazzo Schwarzburg closed behind the last departing guests, Clara remained at the piano, playing softly in the gradually dimming candlelight. The melodies that flowed from her fingers now were different, no longer tinged with loneliness and longing, but rich with possibility and hope. She had discovered something profound that evening, that the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from refusing to betray oneself. In a world that demanded conformity, she had chosen authenticity. In a society that valued appearance over substance, she had offered truth. And in doing so, she had not only found her place among Vienna's elite, she had elevated what it meant to be elite at all. The autumn wind still whispered through the streets outside, but inside the palazzo, the music continued long into the night, carrying with it the promise of all the beautiful songs yet to be written, all the hearts yet to be touched, all the walls yet to be torn down by the simple revolutionary act of one person choosing to be genuinely, courageously themselves. In the weeks that followed, Clara's name became synonymous with musical excellence throughout Vienna. Invitations poured in from the finest salons, requests for private performances, and even whispers of a possible position as court musician. But more importantly, she had sparked a subtle revolution in the way the aristocracy thought about talent and worth. Marquis Victor von Habsburg, forever changed by that evening, became one of her most ardent supporters, using his influence to ensure that other young artists from humble backgrounds would receive the opportunities they deserved. His transformation from cruel critic to champion of the arts became the subject of countless salon conversations, proof that even the most hardened hearts could be opened by authentic beauty. And Clara, no longer the timid outsider seeking acceptance, had become something far more valuable, a bridge between worlds, a reminder that the most profound nobility lies not in what we inherit, but in what we choose to create and share with the world. The Bissendorfer piano in Palazzo Schwarzburg seemed to glow with new warmth whenever she played, as if it too had been awakened to its highest purpose. And sometimes, late at night when the palazzo was quiet, staff members would swear they could still hear echoes of that transformative melody, floating through the halls like a ghost of pure inspiration, reminding everyone who heard it that true art has the power to change not just minds but souls. The story of the French girl who silenced a ballroom with her music became legend in Vienna, passed down through generations as proof that talent recognizes no boundaries, that beauty speaks all languages, and that sometimes the most profound victories are won not through force or cunning, but through the simple courage to let one's authentic self be heard above the noise of the world. 3 months had passed since that transformative evening, and Vienna's social landscape had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Clara now walked through the same streets that had once felt foreign and unwelcoming with the confidence of someone who had found her rightful place in the world. Her morning routine included private lessons at the Imperial Conservatory, where Professor Heinrich Zimmermann, Vienna's most respected music instructor, had taken her under his wing. Mademoiselle Beaumont, he would say during their sessions, his weathered hands guiding hers across the keys. You possess something that cannot be taught, the ability to make silence speak. My job is simply to give you more languages in which to say it. The conservatory's practice rooms had become Clara's sanctuary. Here, surrounded by the gentle chaos of aspiring musicians, she worked tirelessly to expand her repertoire while developing her gift for composition. Her improvised piece from that fateful night had been transcribed and was now being performed in salons across the Austrian Empire. But Clara's focus had shifted to something far more ambitious. She was composing a full concerto, a musical autobiography that would tell not just her story, but the stories of all those who had ever stood on the outside looking in. The piece would premiere at the Imperial Opera House, with Clara herself as the featured soloist alongside the Vienna Philharmonic. It was an honor unprecedented for someone of her age and background. A success, Clara was learning, brought its own unique challenges. The pressure must be enormous, observed Archduke Franz during one of their weekly meetings in the Imperial Gardens. Their relationship had evolved from patron and protege to something approaching genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared passion for the arts. Franz had proven to be more than just another noble admirer. He possessed a keen musical mind and often served as Clara's sounding board for new compositions. His military bearing had softened in her presence, revealing a thoughtful soul who understood the weight of public expectation. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night with melodies in my head, Clara confided, watching the early winter frost sparkle on the perfectly manicured hedges. But along with the music comes fear. Fear that I'll never again create something as pure as what came through me that night at the palazzo. Franz nodded thoughtfully. My grandfather once told me that the crown becomes heaviest not when you first wear it, but when you realize others are watching to see if you're worthy of it. He paused, his brown eyes studying her profile. But I've observed you these past months, Clara. Your gift isn't diminishing, it's deepening. Their conversations had grown increasingly intimate, though always within the bounds of propriety. Franz's interest in Clara extended beyond her musical talents, but he was acutely aware of the political implications of his feelings. An imperial archduke courting a French bourgeoise, no matter how talented, would send shockwaves through the rigid hierarchy of European nobility. Meanwhile, Marquis Victor von Habsburg was undergoing his own profound transformation. The man who had once wielded cruelty like a fencing sword now found himself consumed by an entirely different passion: artistic patronage. He had established a foundation to support young musicians from modest backgrounds, and his townhouse had been converted into an informal academy where talent mattered more than lineage. "I spent 32 years of my life believing I was superior to others," he confessed to Clara during a chance encounter at a bookshop near the conservatory. His once imperious manner had been replaced by something approaching humility. That night, "Your music didn't just silence the room. It silenced the voice in my head that had been telling me lies about what makes a person valuable." Victor's metamorphosis had not gone unnoticed by Viennese society. Some praised his newfound dedication to the arts, while others whispered that he had lost his mind. But Victor seemed genuinely indifferent to their opinions, finding purpose in nurturing the very talents he had once dismissed. "I've arranged for you to meet Madame Rosalie Brennan," he told Clara, his eyes bright with an enthusiasm that would have been unrecognizable 3 months earlier. "She's a young violinist from Ireland, extraordinary technique, but she's been rejected by every major academy because of her background. I thought perhaps you might—" "Of course," Clara interrupted with a warm smile. "I'd be honored to hear her play." This had become Clara's new role in Viennese society, not just performer, but advocate for artistic merit over social standing. Young musicians sought her out for advice and encouragement, and she found herself becoming the very mentor she had once needed. But it was during a private dinner at her aunt's residence that Clara received the most unexpected news of all. Countess Marguerite had invited a small group of Clara's closest supporters, including Franz and Victor, for an intimate evening of music and conversation. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost familial, as they gathered around the modest piano in the Countess's drawing room. "My dear friends," the Countess announced as dessert was served, her voice carrying an unusual gravity, "I have news that will affect us all." She paused, her weathered hands smoothing her burgundy silk skirt. "I have received a letter from the imperial court. Clara has been formally invited to perform at the Emperor's birthday celebration next spring, a command performance before crowned heads from across Europe." The room fell silent. A command performance for Emperor Ferdinand himself was the highest honor that could be bestowed upon any musician. It would place Clara among the most celebrated artists of the age. Furthermore, the Countess continued, "There is another matter." Her eyes found Franz, whose complexion had gone noticeably pale. The invitation came with an inquiry about Clara's availability for more permanent arrangements at court. Everyone understood the implication. The imperial family was testing the waters for a possible elevation in Clara's status, perhaps even considering her as a potential match for a member of the royal household. Franz set down his wineglass with trembling fingers. "Clara," he said quietly, "there's something I must tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." The room held its breath as he rose from his chair and moved to stand before her. Even Victor, usually so composed, watched with undisguised fascination. "That is, my feelings for you have grown beyond admiration for your talent," Franz said, his military training the only thing keeping his voice steady. "I know the complications this creates. I know the challenges we would face, but I cannot remain silent any longer." Clara felt her heart stop, then begin beating with a rhythm that seemed to match one of her own compositions. She had sensed his growing affection, had felt her own feelings deepening in response, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly, wonderfully real. "Franz," she whispered, rising to face him, I feel the same, but the obstacles ... can be overcome," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "Love has its own nobility, Clara. What we feel for each other, it's not bound by titles or traditions. It's something entirely new." Victor cleared his throat gently. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying a new authority born of hard-won wisdom, "I believe I speak for everyone here when I say that Clara has already proven herself worthy of any title, any position, any honor that could be bestowed upon her, simply by being herself." The Countess wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her niece step into a future that would have been unimaginable just months before. The frightened young woman who had arrived from Lyon had been replaced by someone who commanded respect not through birth or wealth, but through the sheer force of authentic talent and genuine character. As winter deepened into the new year of 1848, Clara's upcoming concerto premiere became the most anticipated cultural event in Vienna. But now it carried additional significance. It would be her formal introduction to European royalty as the Archduke's intended bride. The announcement of their engagement had sent ripples of shock and admiration throughout the continent, challenging centuries of matrimonial tradition. "Are you nervous about the performance or about everything else?" Franz asked as they walked through the snow-covered gardens of Schönbrunn Palace, their breath visible in the crisp air. Clara considered the question carefully. "The music doesn't frighten me anymore," she said. "Music is honest. It either moves people or it doesn't, but becoming part of your world, that still terrifies me sometimes." Franz stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You're not becoming part of my world, Clara. We're creating our own world, one where worth is measured by the content of someone's character and the beauty they bring into existence." As they stood there in the falling snow, Clara realized that her journey had come full circle. The young woman who had once been mocked for her presumption to belong among Vienna's elite was now poised to help reshape what elite even meant. Her music had opened doors she never could have imagined, but more importantly, it had opened hearts and minds to the possibility that nobility could be earned rather than inherited. The concerto she would premiere in just 2 months would be more than a musical performance. It would be a declaration that talent and authenticity could triumph over prejudice and tradition. And as she stood in Franz's embrace, surrounded by the pristine beauty of the imperial gardens, Clara knew that the most beautiful melodies were yet to be written. The night of the premiere arrived with all the pomp and circumstance that Vienna could muster. The Imperial Opera House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, its red velvet seats filled with the most distinguished audience ever assembled in the Austrian capital. Crowned heads from Prussia, Bavaria, and the Italian states occupied the royal boxes, while diplomats, artists, and nobility filled every remaining seat. Backstage, Clara stood before an ornate mirror in her dressing room, barely recognizing the woman who stared back at her. Gone was the uncertain French girl in the simple teal dress. In her place stood a confident artist wearing a gown of midnight blue silk, adorned with diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. The dress had been a gift from Empress Maria Anna herself, a gesture of imperial approval that spoke volumes about Clara's elevated status. The Emperor himself requested this evening's performance, announced Court Chamberlain Count von Dietrichstein, as he entered with final instructions. His Majesty is particularly eager to hear the piece that has caused such discussion throughout Europe. Indeed, news of Clara's engagement to Archduke Franz had created diplomatic ripples far beyond Vienna's borders. Conservative courts whispered about dangerous precedents, while progressive thinkers hailed it as a sign of changing times. Tonight's performance would be scrutinized not just as art, but as a political statement. 5 minutes, mademoiselle, came a voice from the corridor. Clara took a final look at herself, then made her way toward the stage where the Vienna Philharmonic waited. Conductor Johann Herbeck, initially skeptical about featuring such a young and unconventional soloist, had become one of her most ardent supporters during rehearsals. "Your music speaks a language I've never heard before," he had told her during their final practice session. "Tonight we don't just perform your concerto, we introduce the world to a new voice." As Clara approached the piano on stage, the enormous audience rose in respectful silence. She could see Franz in the imperial box, his military dress uniform gleaming with decorations, his eyes filled with pride and love. Beside him sat Emperor Ferdinand, whose expression was unreadable but attentive. In another box she spotted Marquis Victor, who nodded encouragingly when their eyes met. But it was in the upper galleries that Clara found her truest supporters, the young musicians, students and artists who had come to witness one of their own achieve the impossible. Their faces glowed with hope and inspiration, seeing in Clara's journey a reflection of their own dreams. The conductor raised his baton, and the opening measures of Clara's concerto filled the opera house. The orchestral introduction was deliberately modest, almost hesitant, representing the uncertainty of someone seeking their place in an unfamiliar world. But as Clara's piano joined the ensemble, the music transformed into something boldly confident. The first movement told the story of arrival and displacement, of feeling like a stranger in an elegant world. Clara's fingers danced across the keys with technical brilliance, but more importantly, with emotional honesty that made each note feel inevitable. The music spoke of loneliness transformed into determination, of fear overcome by courage. During the gentle second movement, a love theme emerged, tender, hopeful, but tinged with uncertainty about the future. Clara caught sight of Franz leaning forward in his seat, understanding that this melody was written for him, about the impossibly beautiful complexity of their love story. But it was the final movement that truly stunned the audience. Building from a whisper to a triumphant declaration, the music became a celebration of authenticity over artifice, of merit over birthright, of love over convention. Clara's playing reached heights of virtuosity that left even seasoned musicians shaking their heads in amazement. Her entire body seemed to become an extension of the instrument, channeling emotions too complex for words through cascades of sound that seemed to lift the very roof of the opera house. As the final notes faded into silence, the audience remained frozen for several heartbeats. Then Emperor Ferdinand himself rose to his feet, beginning an ovation that quickly spread throughout the entire opera house. The applause continued for nearly 10 minutes, with calls of brava echoing from every corner of the magnificent hall. Clara stood beside the piano, tears streaming down her face as roses rained down from the galleries. She had not merely performed, she had shared her soul with 1,000 strangers and watched them recognize something of themselves in her music. Extraordinary, the Emperor declared during the reception that followed. Absolutely extraordinary. Mademoiselle Beaumont, or should I say, Your Highness, you have given us all a great gift tonight. The formal acknowledgement of her upcoming title sent another wave of excitement through the assembled dignitaries. Clara was no longer just a talented musician who had caught an archduke's eye. She was being formally welcomed into the imperial family. But even as she accepted congratulations from kings and queens, Clara's attention was drawn to a young woman hovering at the edge of the crowd. She recognized her immediately. Rosalie Brennan, the Irish violinist Victor, had introduced her 2 months earlier. Miss Brennan, Clara excused herself from a conversation with the Bavarian crown prince to approach the younger woman. I'm so glad you came tonight. Rosalie's eyes were still bright with tears from the performance. Your Highness, she began, but Clara quickly interrupted. Please, just Clara. We're artists first. Everything else second. I wanted to thank you, Rosalie continued, her Irish accent adding music to her words. Because of your foundation, because of what you've shown is possible, I've been accepted to the conservatory. My first composition will be performed next month. Clara felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the evening's triumphs. This, seeing talent recognized regardless of background, was perhaps her greatest achievement. 6 months later, as spring returned to Vienna, Clara stood in the cathedral where she would marry Franz in just 2 hours. Her wedding dress, a masterpiece of French silk and Austrian craftsmanship, represented the union of her 2 worlds. But more than that, it symbolized how she had grown from someone trying to fit into existing molds to someone creating entirely new possibilities. Are you ready for this, my dear? Asked Countess Marguerite, adjusting Clara's veil with gentle hands. Her aunt had aged gracefully into her new role as confidant to an Archduchess Stube, but her eyes still held the same warmth that had welcomed Clara to Vienna nearly a year ago. I think I've been ready for this moment my entire life, Clara replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Everything that happened before, all the struggle, all the doubt, it was preparing me for this. Through the cathedral windows she could hear the sounds of Vienna awakening. Street musicians played beneath her balcony, many of them students who had benefited from the scholarship program she had established. The city itself seemed to have evolved, becoming more welcoming to artistic innovation and social mobility. As the cathedral bells began to chime, announcing the ceremony, Clara took one final look at herself in the mirror. The reflection showed a woman transformed not by titles or wealth, but by the courage to remain authentically herself while growing into something greater. She had become living proof that the most profound revolutions begin not with armies or politics, but with individuals brave enough to share their truth with the world. The doors to the cathedral opened, revealing an aisle lined with representatives from every corner of European society. But Clara's eyes found Franz immediately, standing at the altar in his dress uniform, his face radiant with joy and love. As she began her walk down the aisle, the cathedral's magnificent organ began to play, not a traditional wedding march, but a piece Clara had composed specifically for this moment. It was a melody that spoke of 2 souls finding each other across the artificial boundaries of class and convention, creating harmony from what seemed like impossible differences. With each step toward Franz, Clara felt the weight of history shifting. Their union would be remembered not just as a royal wedding, but as the moment when the Austrian Empire declared that love and talent could triumph over tradition and prejudice. Future generations would look back on this day as the beginning of a new era, when courts across Europe slowly began to value merit alongside bloodlines. But for Clara, walking toward the man who had seen past her origins to recognize her worth, the moment was both monumentally historic and intimately personal. She was not just marrying an archduke, she was choosing a partner who understood that their love story was inseparable from their shared commitment to creating a more just and beautiful world. As she reached the altar and placed her hand in Franz's, Clara heard something that made her heart soar. From somewhere in the congregation came the sound of someone humming along with the organ, recognizing the melody from one of her earlier compositions. Within moments, other voices had joined in, creating an impromptu chorus that filled the ancient cathedral with music born from genuine emotion rather than mere protocol. It was, Clara realized, the perfect metaphor for what she had accomplished, taking something personal and authentic, and watching it inspire others to find their own voices, their own courage, their own capacity for beauty. The shy French girl who had once feared she would never belong had instead transformed the very definition of belonging itself. 2 years into their marriage, Clara and Franz had established what became known throughout Europe as the Vienna Renaissance, a cultural revolution that prioritized artistic merit over aristocratic privilege. Their palace had been transformed into a center of learning where young musicians, painters, and writers from across the continent came to study and create without regard to their social origins. But it was on a crisp October morning in 1850 that Clara received news that would test everything she had built. A messenger arrived with an urgent letter bearing the seal of the French Republic. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal, Franz watching with concern from across their private study. "What is it, my love?" he asked, setting down his morning correspondence. Clara's face had gone pale as she read. "It's from Lyons," she whispered. "My childhood music teacher, Monsieur Dubois, he's dying, but that's not... Franz, he's revealed something extraordinary." She looked up at him with eyes wide with shock. "He says my father wasn't who I thought he was." The letter explained that Clara's mother had been briefly married to a minor French nobleman before her marriage to the merchant Clara had always known as her father. The nobleman had died in a carriage accident when Clara was barely 2 years old, but not before legally recognizing her as his daughter. Clara was technically of noble blood, French nobility, but nobility nonetheless. "All these years," Clara said, sinking into her chair, "I fought to prove that breeding doesn't matter, that talent transcends bloodlines. And now I discovered that I had noble blood all along." Franz knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Does it change anything? Does it change who you are, what you've accomplished, what you believe?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "No," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "If anything, it proves my point even more powerfully. I succeeded not because of noble blood I didn't even know I had, but despite thinking I lacked it. Every person who dismissed me, every barrier I overcame, those were real struggles that shaped who I became." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over Vienna's rooftops where chimney smoke rose like musical notes against the autumn sky. "This secret doesn't validate my achievements, Franz. It validates my beliefs. I am living proof that what we accomplish matters more than what we inherit." Franz smiled, recognizing the fire that had first captivated him at that memorable piano performance. "So what do we do with this information?" "We use it," Clara said with growing conviction. "We announce it publicly, but not as justification for my success. As evidence that noble birth means nothing without noble actions. I'll tell the story of how I succeeded while believing myself common-born, and challenge others to examine their own prejudices." The revelation, when made public, sent shockwaves through European society. Conservative elements who had grudgingly accepted Clara's elevation suddenly felt vindicated, claiming her success was due to inherent nobility after all. But progressive thinkers seized on the deeper truth that Clara's achievements remained unchanged regardless of her bloodline. The most surprising reaction came from an unexpected source. Marquis Victor von Habsburg requested a private audience. Arriving at the palace with an expression Clara had never seen before, something approaching vulnerability mixed with determination. "Your Highness," he began formally, then caught himself. "Clara, your revelation has forced me to confront something I've been avoiding for 2 years. He paused, struggling with words in a way that reminded Clara of their first encounter, but now his struggle came from humility rather than arrogance. "I need to tell you about the night you played at the Palazzo Schwarzburg," he continued. "What your music revealed to me wasn't just the beauty of authentic talent. It revealed the ugliness of what I had become, a man so afraid of his own inadequacy that he attacked others to feel superior." Clara gestured for him to sit, sensing this conversation would be significant for both of them. "The truth is," Victor continued, "I envied you that night. Not your talent, I've never been musical, but your courage. You stood in front of people who had rejected you and chose to be vulnerably, authentically yourself. I realized I hadn't been authentic in years, perhaps decades." He looked directly at her, his steel blue eyes now holding warmth she had never seen before. "Your music didn't just change how I saw you. It changed how I saw myself. And now, learning that you succeeded while believing you lacked noble blood, it's made me question what nobility even means. What do you think it means? Clara asked gently. I think, Victor said slowly, that you taught me nobility is a choice we make every day. It's choosing truth over comfort, courage over safety, service over selfishness. He smiled with genuine warmth. You were noble long before you knew about your bloodline, Clara. You were noble the moment you sat down at that piano and chose to share your truth with a room full of strangers. Over the following months, Clara's revelations sparked what historians would later call the Great Reconsideration, a continent-wide examination of social structures and values. Universities began offering scholarships based purely on merit. Noble families started adopting children from common backgrounds and raising them as equals. Artists across Europe found new patrons willing to support talent regardless of origins. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in Clara's own heart. The young woman who had once desperately sought acceptance from others had become someone who helped others accept themselves. Her palace had become a refuge for anyone struggling to find their voice, their place, their purpose. It was during a winter evening in 1851, as Clara prepared for another performance, this one a benefit concert for her scholarship foundation, that she encountered a face from her past. Standing nervously in the artist's entrance to the Imperial Opera House was a young woman Clara recognized immediately, though she had aged considerably. Mademoiselle Richter, Clara said warmly, approaching the woman who had once whispered cruel comments behind fans at social gatherings. How wonderful to see you again. The young woman, now Lady Richter through marriage, looked mortified. Your Highness, I don't deserve your kindness. The things I said about you when you first arrived in Vienna, I was horrible. Clara studied the woman's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with something else, admiration, perhaps even aspirations. What brings you here tonight, Lady Richter? I've been composing, she admitted quietly. Nothing as grand as your work, but after hearing your music that night at the Palazzo, I realized I'd been so focused on judging others that I'd never explored my own talents. I wondered if you might listen to something I've written. Clara felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced when meeting Rosalie Brennan, when establishing her foundation, when watching other young artists find their courage. This was why she had suffered, why she had struggled, why she had ultimately triumphed, not for her own glory, but to light the path for others. I would be honored to hear your composition, Lady Richter, Clara said with genuine enthusiasm. But first tell me, what inspired you to begin creating music? Lady Richter's eyes filled with tears. Watching you that night, I realized I had been so afraid of being judged that I had become the judge. Your music showed me there was another way to live, with courage instead of fear, creation instead of criticism. She paused, then added quietly, You didn't just play beautifully that night. You showed us all what beauty really means. As they walked together toward the rehearsal room, Clara reflected on how far they had all traveled from that autumn evening in 1847. She had begun as an outsider seeking inclusion, but had discovered something far more valuable, the power to create a world where no one needed to remain outside, where every voice had value, where talent could flourish regardless of its origins. The shy French girl who had once trembled before Vienna's elite had become the woman who helped others find the courage to stop trembling and start singing. And in doing so, she had learned that the greatest victories are not won by conquering others, but by inspiring them to conquer themselves. 5 years had passed since Clara's wedding, and the ripple effects of her influence had spread far beyond Vienna's borders. On a humid summer afternoon in 1853, she received an unexpected visitor that would challenge her understanding of impact in ways she never anticipated. The visitor was announced as Miss Catherine Morrison from London, but when the young woman entered Clara's private study, her resemblance to someone from Clara's past was unmistakable. Your Highness, the woman said with a deep curtsy, her English accent refined but trembling with emotion. I am the daughter of Lord Morrison, the British ambassador who was present at your first performance at Palazzo Schwarzburg. Clara remembered the man, a stern-faced diplomat who had watched her performance with skeptical eyes before being moved to tears by the final notes. She gestured for the young woman to sit, noting the way Catherine's hands fidgeted with her reticule in a manner that reminded Clara of her own nervous habits from years past. My father returned to London a changed man after that evening, Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength. He told my mother and me about a young French woman who had redefined courage itself through music. But more than that, he began to see me differently. Catherine paused, her eyes distant with memory. You see, I had always been a disappointment to him. While my brothers excelled at traditionally masculine pursuits, I showed interest only in mathematics and natural sciences, subjects he deemed entirely inappropriate for a young lady of my station. Clara felt a familiar stirring of understanding, and after Vienna, he encouraged me to pursue my interests. He said if a woman could silence a room full of aristocrats with nothing but authenticity and talent, then perhaps his daughter could contribute to the world in ways he had never imagined. Catherine's eyes brightened with pride. I've just been accepted to study at Cambridge University. Not officially, of course, but Professor Babbage has agreed to mentor me in mathematical research. Clara felt that familiar warmth she experienced whenever her influence had opened doors for others. Your father sounds like a remarkable man to change so completely. The most remarkable part, Catherine said, leaning forward with intensity, is that he didn't just change his mind about me. He returned to London and began advocating for educational opportunities for women throughout England. He's established 3 schools for girls in subjects traditionally reserved for boys. She smiled through tears that had begun to fall. He says he learned from you that society progresses not by maintaining boundaries, but by celebrating those brave enough to cross them. That evening, Clara shared Catherine's story with Franz over dinner in their private dining room. The space had evolved over the years to reflect their shared values, the walls lined with portraits of artists, musicians, and scholars they had sponsored, rather than the traditional gallery of ancestors. It's extraordinary, Franz mused, cutting his roast with thoughtful precision. That one evening, one performance continues to create changes we'll never even know about. How many other daughters have been encouraged by fathers who were present that night? How many other dreams have been given permission to exist? Clara set down her wineglass, struck by a sudden realization. Franz, I've been thinking about legacy lately. Not the tangible things, the foundation, the scholarships, the changes to court protocol, but the intangible ones. The conversations that happened in carriages riding home from that performance. The young women who saw what was possible and dared to dream differently. What are you thinking? Franz asked, recognizing the contemplative expression that usually preceded Clara's most innovative ideas. I want to document these stories, Clara said, her voice gaining excitement. Not just my story, but all the stories that grew from it. Catherine Morrison, Lady Richter's transformation, Victor's journey from cruelty to compassion. I want to write a book that shows how one act of authenticity can cascade through countless lives, Franz smiled, remembering the determined young woman who had once faced down Vienna's social elite with nothing but a piano and her own truth. And what would you call this book? Clara was quiet for a moment, then smiled with the same radiance Franz had first noticed in the candlelit ballroom years earlier. The courage to sing, how one voice can change the world. The project consumed Clara for the next 2 years. She corresponded with people across Europe who had been touched by her story, collecting testimonials and transformations that painted a picture of social change more profound than any political revolution. The book, when published in 1855, became an immediate sensation, not just as a memoir, but as a manifesto for anyone who had ever felt their voice didn't matter. But it was while working on the final chapter that Claire experienced perhaps the most unexpected encounter of all. She was in her study, reviewing manuscripts late one evening when Franz entered with an expression of barely contained excitement. My love, there's someone here to see you. Someone who has traveled a very long way. He paused dramatically. Someone from your past who has quite a story to tell. Clara looked up from her papers, curious but unprepared for the figure who appeared in her doorway. The woman was elegantly dressed but showed the wear of long travel. When she spoke, her accent carried the familiar cadences of Lyon, but refined by years of education and experience. Mademoiselle Clara, the woman said with a warm smile, though I suppose I should say, Your Highness now. I am Madame Sophie Dubois, formerly Sophie Laurent. Do you remember me? Clara's hand flew to her mouth in recognition. Sophie Laurent had been her closest childhood friend in Lyon, the baker's daughter who had shared Clara's love of music, but whose family could never afford proper lessons. They had lost touch when Clara moved to Vienna, but now Sophie stood before her transformed, clearly educated, confident, successful. Sophie, Clara exclaimed, rising to embrace her old friend. I can't believe. How did you find me? What brings you to Vienna? Sophie laughed, the sound carrying echoes of the girl Clara remembered. Your book brought me here, Clara. Well, not just the book, but what it represented. You see, after you left Lyon, your story began to spread. People talked about the baker's daughter's friend who had conquered Vienna through music. It inspired me to pursue my own dreams. She gestured to her fine dress and confident bearing. I taught myself to read and write properly, found work as a governess, saved every coin I could. Eventually, I was able to attend the conservatory in Paris, not as a performer, but as a composer. I've written 3 operas now, Clara. 3 operas that have been performed across France. Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. Sophie, that's incredible. But you said the book brought you here. I wanted to thank you, Sophie said simply. Not just for inspiring me, but for showing all of us that our dreams don't have to remain dreams. Your courage gave me permission to have courage. But more than that, all quotes, she paused, reaching into her traveling bag to withdraw a carefully wrapped package. I've written something for you. An opera based on your story. But not just your story. The story of every woman who has ever been told she doesn't belong, who has ever been made to feel her voice doesn't matter. Sophie unwrapped the manuscript reverently. I call it La Voix du Cœur, the voice of the heart. Clara took the manuscript with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the cyclical beauty of the moment. Her own journey from obscurity to recognition had inspired her childhood friend to achieve her own dreams. And now Sophie had transformed Clara's story into art that could inspire countless others. There's something else, Sophie continued, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. The Opera House in Paris wants to premiere it next season. They want you to attend, of course, but more than that, double quotes, she paused, building suspense. They want you to conduct the final scene, the scene where the protagonist, who represents all of us who have ever felt voiceless, finally finds her courage to sing. Clara looked at Franz, who was beaming with pride, then back at Sophie, whose face glowed with the satisfaction of dreams achieved and friendships honored. In that moment, Clara understood that her story had become larger than her individual journey. It had become a symbol, a catalyst, a continuing source of inspiration that would outlive her own lifetime. I would be honored to conduct that scene, Sophie, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. But only if you promise me something. Anything, Sophie replied immediately. Promise me that after the premiere, you'll seek out other young women with dreams they're afraid to pursue. Promise me that you'll tell them what you just told me, that courage is contagious, that one person's breakthrough can become another person's beginning. Sophie nodded solemnly, understanding that Clara was passing on more than just a request. She was passing on a responsibility to keep the cycle of inspiration alive. As they embraced again, Clara realized that this was what true success looked like. Not personal achievement, but the multiplication of possibilities for others. The frightened young woman who had once wondered if she belonged anywhere had discovered that belonging wasn't about finding the right place. It was about creating spaces where others could belong too. The opera premiere 6 months later would be attended by dignitaries from across Europe. But Clara knew the real audience was every person who had ever felt their voice didn't matter. Through Sophie's music and her own conducting, they would tell those listening souls that every voice has value, every dream has worth, and every act of authentic courage creates ripples that extend far beyond what the eye can see. The morning of the Paris Opera premiere dawned with an unseasonable warmth for October 1856, as if the very air recognized the significance of the day. Clara stood on the balcony of her hotel suite overlooking the Seine, watching the early morning mist rise from the water like musical notes ascending from a grand staff. In just 12 hours, she would conduct the final scene of La Voix du Cœur before an audience that included the Emperor of France himself. But it was a letter that had arrived with her morning coffee that truly captured her attention. The envelope bore no return address, only her name written in a shaky, uncertain hand. Inside, she found a message that would forever change her understanding of how far her influence had traveled. Your Highness, the letter began, you do not know me, but I know you through the story that has sustained me through the darkest period of my life. My name is Maria Santos, and I am writing to you from a small village outside Madrid, where I teach music to children whose families cannot afford proper instruction. Clara settled into her chair, drawn in by the intimate tone of the correspondence. 3 years ago, I was in a situation I believed hopeless. My husband had died suddenly, leaving me with 4 young children and debts I could not repay. I had been trained as a pianist in my youth, but society told me that a widow's place was to mourn quietly, not to pursue dreams of independence. I was preparing to send my children to live with relatives while I sought work as a seamstress when I heard your story. The letter continued with increasing emotional intensity. A traveling merchant told me about a French girl who had conquered Vienna with nothing but courage and a piano. He said you proved that a woman's worth was not determined by her circumstances, but by her willingness to share her gifts with the world. That night I made a decision that saved not just my life, but the lives of my children. Clara found herself holding her breath as she read. I took my mother's old piano, the only valuable thing I owned, and instead of selling it for immediate money, I used it to start giving lessons. Word spread through our village and neighboring towns. Within a year, I had enough students to support my family. But more than that, I was teaching children who had never imagined they could make music, showing them that beauty could emerge from the humblest circumstances. The letter's climax brought tears to Clara's eyes. Last month, one of my students, a shepherd's daughter named Isabella, was accepted to the Royal Conservatory in Madrid with a full scholarship. When she played her audition piece, the judges asked where she had learned such soulful expression. She told them about her teacher who had learned from the story of a brave woman in Vienna that music belongs to anyone courageous enough to claim it. Clara set the letter down with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the realization that her story had traveled through oral tradition across international borders, transforming lives she would never meet, in villages she would never visit. Franz found her on the balcony an hour later, still holding Maria's letter, tears streaming down her face. "What is it, my love?" he asked, immediately concerned. Clara handed him the letter without speaking. As he read, his expression shifted from worry to wonder to profound admiration. "Clara," he said quietly when he finished, "do you understand what this means? Your influence isn't just changing individuals, it's changing how entire communities think about possibility." That evening, as Clara prepared for the performance, she carried Maria's letter with her to the opera house. Backstage, Sophie was pacing nervously, her own dreams about to be realized before the most prestigious audience in Europe. "I'm terrified," Sophie confessed as Clara approached. "What if they don't understand what we're trying to say? What if the music isn't powerful enough?" Clara took her friend's hands, thinking of Maria Santos teaching piano in a Spanish village, of Catherine Morrison studying mathematics in England, of Lady Richter composing in Vienna, of countless other women whose names she would never know but whose courage had been awakened by a single night of authenticity. "Sophie," she said with quiet conviction, "the music was already powerful enough the moment you chose to write it. Tonight isn't about proving anything to them, it's about giving permission to everyone listening to believe in their own voice." As the curtain rose on La Voix du Coeur, Clara took her position at the conductor's podium for the final scene. The opera house was packed with nobility, diplomats, critics, and artists. But she could feel the presence of all the invisible audience members. Every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong. Every dreamer who had been discouraged from pursuing their gifts. Every soul who needed proof that authenticity could triumph over convention. The music swelled under her direction, telling the story not just of one woman's journey, but of the universal human struggle to find and use one's voice. Sophie's composition was magnificent, technically brilliant but emotionally honest, sophisticated yet accessible. As the soprano on stage sang the climactic aria about choosing courage over comfort, Clara felt the same transcendent connection she had experienced at that first performance in Vienna 9 years earlier. But this time was different. This time she wasn't the frightened young woman seeking acceptance. She was the mature artist sharing a platform with her childhood friend, conducting music that celebrated every person who had ever dared to dream beyond their circumstances. The scared girl from Lyon and the baker's daughter from the same streets were now collaborating on a stage that would have been unimaginable to their younger selves. As the final notes faded and the audience erupted in thunderous applause, Clara and Sophie embraced at center stage. The ovation continued for nearly 15 minutes, with calls for encore and bouquets of flowers raining from every box and balcony. But the most meaningful moment came after the curtain fell, when a young woman approached them backstage. She was clearly not part of the aristocratic audience, her simple dress and nervous manner marking her as someone who had likely saved for months to afford a ticket. "Your Highness, Madame Dubois," she said in heavily accented French, "I am Alina Petrov, from Russia. I walked from Moscow to Paris to hear this opera because your story gave me courage to leave a marriage that was destroying my soul. I have nothing now but the clothes on my back and a violin my grandmother left me, but tonight I believe I can build a new life." Clara and Sophie exchanged glances, both understanding that this young woman represented the true measure of their success. Not the applause of emperors or the praise of critics, but the courage kindled in one human heart by the example of authentic living. "Elena," Clara said gently, "do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" The young woman shook her head, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Then you'll stay with us," Sophie declared immediately. "And tomorrow we'll help you find a position where your violin can support you while you decide what comes next." As they left the opera house that night, Clara, Franz, Sophie, and Elena walking together through the gaslit streets of Paris, Clara reflected on how far they had all traveled. From that autumn evening in Vienna, what had begun as one woman's desperate attempt to prove her worth had become a movement of liberation that crossed national boundaries and social classes. The frightened girl who had once wondered if she belonged anywhere had learned the most profound truth of all. Belonging isn't something you find or earn. It's something you create by having the courage to be authentically yourself. knowing that your example gives others permission to do the same. And in that shared authenticity and that collective courage to sing, despite fear, entire worlds could be transformed one voice at a time.